Welcome back to episode 15 of Lighthouse Health and Safety Podcast. I am your host, Andrew Chandran, and today's topic is on hazardous dusts and fibres in the workplace. Most occupational hygienists who start their careers will cut their teeth on hazardous dusts and fibres, simply because dusts and fibres are very visible, particularly in the mining industry. They are not just visible internal hazards, but very visible to anyone outside of the mine as well, and often a major complaint from local community groups. So as a consequence, they tend to generate a lot of interest. There's a lot of monitoring around hazardous dust and fibres, and there is great expense paid on trying to minimize the amount of dust that is generated. In the early part of my career, I spent quite a lot of time dealing with asbestos. Asbestos monitoring was very big. The monitoring itself was quite lucrative. Consultancies made quite a bit of money on monitoring for asbestos. And respirable crystalline silica has often been right there next to asbestos, simply because these are materials that are everywhere. So much so that every person, regardless of whether you're working with these materials or not, you will have components of respirable crystalline silica and asbestos within your lung. But don't be too concerned by that. As with any occupational health hazard, exposure is very, very important. And there are exposure standards for both of these hazardous chemicals, because even though they might be dust and fibres, they do fall under the broader category of hazardous chemicals. And you can find those exposure standards. They're available through Safe Work Australia's website. And over my career in occupational hygiene, those exposure standards have only gone one way, and that is down. So just a quick agenda for today's episode. We're going to look at the hazards themselves. What is crystalline silica? What is asbestos? Where do they originate? How can a person be exposed to them? We are then going to look at the two inhalable fractions of these particles. One being the total inhalable fraction, the second being the respirable fraction, which is the much smaller fraction that gets deep within the lungs. We are then going to look at lung function and lung clearance mechanisms. And then following that, the major diseases that are caused by unmanaged exposures to these hazardous chemicals, including silicosis and asbestosis, which are forms of lung fibrosis. We're then going to look at mesothelioma and other lung cancers, and I'm going to take a bit of a deep dive into how cancers develop, which I think is very, very interesting, because that'll be relevant across the board of other types of exposures to hazardous chemicals. I'm going to talk a bit about a disease which you all need to be aware of. It's actually a major cause of death in people, and that is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So although we may associate particular diseases with exposure to respirable crystalline silica and asbestos, I do want you to understand that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is the fourth leading cause of death in the world. And as such, we need to really manage exposures to all kinds of dusts that can get into the lower region of the lung. Finally, I'll finish off with touching on risk assessment and controls to manage your exposures to these hazardous chemicals. But let's start with the respirable crystalline silica, or RCS. What is it? So on the screen in front of me, I've just put up this chart from the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention. And what it is it looks at the different types of silica that exist naturally or are produced through what we call man-made processes. Now, silica itself is silicon dioxide, and that may be amorphous or crystalline in nature, and naturally occurring silica will often contain both of these components. Crystalline silica commonly includes quartz, but may also include cristobalite and tridymite. So traditionally, these are really the three forms of crystalline silica that are of interest in occupational exposures. Now, interestingly enough, crystalline silica itself is known as a group 1 human carcinogen. Okay, so it's known to cause cancer. Crystalline silica is hard, it's chemically inert, and has a very high melting point. In other words, it's very durable. So once you breathe it in, once it gets stuck in the lungs and it can't get out, it stays there. And that is where it does its damage over a period of time. Quartz is the most common form of crystalline silica and is the second most common mineral on the Earth's surface. When we breathe in fine crystalline silica, or what we call respirable crystalline silica, this is components that are so small that they get deep within the gas exchange region of the lungs. So that's the alveolar region of the lungs. Then over a period of time, you can develop lung fibrosis from that exposure to crystalline silica. That form of lung fibrosis is termed silicosis, which is an incurable lung disease that causes inflammation and scarring of the lung tissue. And when the tissues get scarred, they have a reduced elasticity. And that reduced elasticity means that they cannot take in as much air in a breath, resulting in shortness of breath and coughing and fatigue and other symptoms. So silicosis itself can develop either quite quickly if you're exposed to very, very high concentrations of respirable crystalline silica, or more typically slowly over time, depending on exposure levels, of course, right? However, it is a potentially fatal condition. And the way people die from silicosis is effectively they suffocate to death. Very, very similar to asbestosis, which I'll cover later. They are both forms of lung fibrosis. The way people die from exposure to those is a slow, suffocating death. I have to present that information to you like that so you appreciate what it is that people experience before they die. So hopefully, if we all care enough, we can do our bit to prevent that from happening. But respirable crystalline silica can cause other health effects as well. They can cause lung cancers. Okay, and it's often associated with silicosis, which produces a reduced capacity of the lung to function. When you have an organ that has a reduced capacity to function, it can be more vulnerable to other types of ailments as well. Believe it or not, respirable crystalline silica can actually cause kidney disease. If the particles are able to get into the bloodstream and interact with the kidney, they're very, very hard, they're very durable, and they're often very sharp and piercing, and they can actually damage the kidney tissue as well. On top of this, crystalline silica can increase the risk of tuberculosis. Now, that's not a disease we tend to see in Australia, but it can also increase the risk of other autoimmune diseases as well. The lungs of the body are very much our engine room, and we need to ensure that that engine room is fully functional. When your lungs start going down, you lose oxygen, and when you lose oxygen, everything else falls apart. Now, exposure to amorphous silica does not cause these same health consequences. However, it is still potentially a dust that you can inhale, and as a result of that, it is something that can affect the lung and actually cause damage. So that is something to be aware of. The lungs do have a capacity to remove some contamination, but for particles of dust that get quite deep in the gas exchange region of the lung, it can be very difficult to remove, and therefore may present a hazard, particularly if you're exposed to a lot of it. In my experience in health and safety, I find that the average worker does not really appreciate um, dust hazards and how vulnerable they are, or how debilitating those exposures can be towards their mid to later end of their life. And just to highlight this point, I was working in a coal-fired boiler environment where the area was just littered with what we call bottom ash, or coal bottom ash. And the organization I was working for, they actually had a safety data sheet for that bottom ash, and I was quite interested in that because the safety data sheet said that the percentage of quartz, right, so this is crystalline silica, was 30 to 60%, which is massive. That is a massive proportion of crystalline silica in the bottom ash. And I was watching contractors just sweeping up this ash without any sort of respiratory protection, and in a fairly low ventilated area. And I was talking to one of the individuals and I said, you should be wearing a respirator like me, right? And then I could see that he wasn't down with it. He wasn't really with me on that. So I just said to him, look, this stuff can cause cancer. And I watched the shift in his face straight away. He went away to grab his respirator. So sometimes you really need to present a risk to people in a way that they're going to take it seriously and respond to it. And now that individual, at a very minimum, will understand that, look, this is particularly harmful. You know, I could get cancer from this, right? And then that is the start of that conversation and the start of that person's risk management journey. Okay, now we're moving on. Let's look at asbestos as a hazard. So the word asbestos is a Greek word. It means inextinguishable or indestructible. It is very, very, very difficult to destroy asbestos, but it can be destroyed in very high temperatures that we can produce with modern technology, or through very, very concentrated hydrofluoric acid. Now, the term asbestos is really a generic name given to a group of naturally occurring fibrous silicate minerals that are of commercial use. And this is where asbestos as a hazard has certainly risen in prominence. Because it's been so effective and so tough and durable, it's found its way into materials that require durability or heat-resistant commercial uses. The three types of asbestos that are of commercial significance are blue asbestos, brown asbestos, and white asbestos. Or at a more technical level, we know them as crystalline, amosite, and chrysotile, respectively. Now on the screen in front of you, I've just put up a bit of a chemical representation of the types of asbestos. There are 6 types of asbestos, chrysotile being the only form of serpentine asbestos, meaning that its shape is curvy, right, like a serpent. And then you have the amphibole types of asbestos. So you've got crystalline there, which is derived from the mineral ribosite, and then you've got amosite, which is the brown asbestos, that is derived from the mineral grunerite. And then you have the other 3 there, but they are not of commercial significance. So the focus is often on the white, the blue, and the brown asbestos. The nature of the hazard of asbestos really comes down to its durability and the fact that it can be ground down and fracture into respirable portions, which can then get deep within the lung, much like respirable crystalline silica. In fact, you could really describe the asbestos hazard as respirable asbestos, because it's really the respirable portion that is of particular interest to occupational health and hygiene professionals. Just like respirable crystalline silica, when these durable fractions get deep within the lung, they can scar the tissue that forms the inside of the lungs and make it very, very difficult to breathe. Okay, so they reduce the elasticity of the spongy components of the lung. That's the alveolar region of the lung. That's the gas exchange region of the lung. But asbestos can also cause pleural plaques. Now, the pleura is a membrane, the outer membrane of the lung, which self-lubricates, and the lubrication is there. So as the lung expands and touches the chest cavity, it doesn't do so with friction, because you can imagine if your lungs were to expand and rub against other organs, that would create friction, that would create pain, that would create inflammation, right? So the pleura is there as a self-lubricating component of the lung to allow the lungs to expand and contract without that friction and inflammation. So imagine having plaques or hardness developed on a lubricating membrane. That could be awfully painful. And then when the pain starts coming, you start to get the aggravation, and then inflammation starts coming, and that just exacerbates the problem. Now, I think most people would have heard the term mesothelioma. Within the name itself, we have two components. We've got the carcinoma component, right, the cancer component, and then we have the mesothelium. So the mesothelium, the mesothelial cells, and the mesothelium represents a lining of the lung where, if it is impacted by those very durable fibres, and those fibres are capable of interacting with the DNA of the mesothelial cells, then you can get cancer developing. Now, mesothelioma itself is a very rare type of fast-growing cancer that is almost always caused by exposure to asbestos. Now, the reason I say that is because that is what we thought for a long time. However, about maybe 25 years ago, they were starting to realize that mesothelioma can also be caused by a man-made machine fiber known as refractory ceramic fibers, right? So us, in our great wisdom, went and created a durable fiber, much like asbestos, that can also cause mesothelioma, and they are refractory ceramic fibers, right? Now, currently, there is no known cure for mesothelioma. Between 700 to 800 people are diagnosed with mesothelioma in Australia each year, with the average time between diagnosis and death being about 11 months. So that is a bit of a summary on the health effects associated with respirable crystalline silica and respirable asbestos. But what do I mean by the term respirable as opposed to the term inhalable? Because they refer to two different fractions of dust and fibers that we can breathe in. Now, on the screen in front of you, I've put a diagram from Safe Work Queensland, which shows a human hair, a cross-section of a human hair, and respirable and inhalable fractions right next to it. So you get an idea of the size we're talking about when we talk about inhalable particulate versus respirable particulate. Inhalable particulate is less than 100 micrometers in diameter. It is very visible. So when we see dust, we are looking at inhalable dust. Okay, it affects your nose, your mouth, your throat, your upper respiratory tract. We've all experienced it. Respirable particulate is less than 10 micrometers in diameter, generally, right? It is normally invisible to the naked eye under normal conditions. And it can reach the lower respiratory tract where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. This is what makes respirable dust particularly harmful. Now, why is that more of a concern than general inhalable dust? It really comes down to how the lung is equipped to deal with the different size particles. Now, within the lung itself, you have the middle to upper respiratory tract. The body uses a form of clearance called mucociliary clearance to remove those larger particles from the mid to upper respiratory tract. You know, I'm talking about your mucus. I'm talking about, what you cough up. I'm talking about what you blow out of your nose, right, to get rid of that contamination. Mucociliary clearance occurs over 24 to 28 hours typically. But in the lower respiratory tract, we don't have such an effective mechanism to get rid of the larger particles. We have a process called alveolar phagocytosis, which is where the white blood cells will try to engulf the offending dust particle or fiber. Remember, respirable, crystalline silica and asbestos, they're very, very durable. So when this organic material tries to engulf, these needle-like components, the cells actually rupture, right? And then, of course, they spill fluid, and then that fluid is what we call pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, and then that causes more problems for the body. So alveolar phagocytosis just simply does not work for very, very fine, durable particles in the lower lung. Okay, that is also a process that it can take months to years to actually clear because of how slowly it works. Okay, and that is really the only mechanism we've got to clear smaller particles in the lung. It's great against breaking things that can be broken, but not for very durable particles. Which means once you've got that asbestos and that respirable crystalline silica deep within your lung tissue, it's not coming out. It is sitting there doing damage, literally with every breath that you take. Now, as I mentioned previously, silicosis and asbestosis are forms of lung fibrosis. So lung fibrosis is the scarring of the gas exchange tissues known as alveoli in the respirable region of the lung. The alveoli are like balloons, right? If they scar, they become less elastic. And when they become less elastic, they can't take in oxygen from the environment. So that is why I said previously, silicosis and asbestosis are often fatal because they cause a slow suffocation. So who is at risk of, silicosis, asbestosis, mesothelioma? If you are involved in any sort of, cutting, sanding, blasting, crushing, milling type of activities where you could be generating very, very fine components from a crystalline silica substrate or a substrate that's containing asbestos, then you may be at risk of exposure to those very, very fine particles. And as I mentioned, if those particles get deep within the lung, it's very, very difficult for them to come out on their own. Over a period of time, you may develop an industrial disease. In Western Australia, we are haunted by a very unfortunate legacy relating to the mining of blue asbestos in the town of Wittenoom in Western Australia. Wittenoom is located in the Pilbara region of WA, and between the 1930s to the mid-1960s, it was Australia's only supplier of blue asbestos. And over the period that it operated, it is estimated that over 2,000 workers and residents perished from exposure to that asbestos. And it highlights a very interesting aspect as well to do with workers and employers and their health and safety obligations. Because some of the people that perished, some of the people that developed asbestos-related disease were not necessarily the workers themselves, but their spouses, because the workers would return home with contaminated clothing, and that clothing was often beaten and dusted, before it was laundered, and in that process, many spouses were exposed to the asbestos and over time developed that asbestos-related disease, which is very, very unfortunate. And it just shows you that, when you are exposed to hazardous materials at work, you need to be very, very careful that you do not bring them back into the non-working environment. And there is a duty that employers have to ensure that they take all reasonable steps to prevent that from happening. There's a very famous song that was written by Midnight Oil in 1990 called Blue Sky Mine. And this was based on the tragedy of Wittenoom. Wittenoom was actually operated by Australian Blue Asbestos, which was a subsidiary of the CSR Corporation, who is known today as a sugar manufacturer. So when you look at the lyrics of the song, and this is just a snippet I've taken from the song itself, it says here, "And if the Blue Sky Mining Company won't come to my rescue, if the sugar refining company won't save me, who's going to save me?" And unfortunately, no one did. And that's the tragedy of Wittenoom, and it's something that we should never forget, because as long as we remember, then we can do something about it to prevent that from happening again. So I wanted to talk a little bit more now about mesothelioma itself and how it actually develops and how cancers in general tend to develop. You know, in the case of the cancer developing, you'll have something like a hazard. In the case of asbestos, you've got the respirable asbestos fibres. They need to penetrate the cells, the mesothelial cells, and interact with the DNA of the cells. In particular, interacting with components of the DNA known as oncogenes. So oncogenes are responsible for cellular reproduction. Now, if you can interfere with an oncogene, that oncogene can reproduce the cell, but in a deformed state, right? A state where the cell no longer serves its intended function, but effectively becomes a redundant cell that consumes resources and energy. Okay, and this is effectively what a cancer is. This is what a tumor becomes. And of course, when the tumor grows, it starves the body of other nutrients as well. So effectively, mesothelioma is a type of cancer caused by the uncontrolled reproduction of dysfunctional oncogenes of the mesothelial cells, right? There you go. That's how the mesothelioma actually develops and propagates. So the next time you go to hospital and you're looking for the cancer ward, well, that's the oncology unit. And that's the reason why the study of cancer is called oncology. It's really to do with these oncogenes. Now, a hidden disease that we all need to be aware of, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay, this is a serious long-term lung disease in which the flow of air into the lungs is gradually reduced by inflammation of the air passages and damage to the lung tissue. So I'm talking again about the respirable region of the lungs. So chronic bronchitis and emphysema are common types of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, in Australia, it is a lung disease that affects approximately 14% of Australians aged 40 and over. But this figure will increase to about 29% in Australians aged 75 years and older. So basically, the older you get, the more exposure you have to, hazardous dusts, and therefore your risk increases with age. In 2024, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was the fourth leading cause of death in the world. Okay, so despite falling death rates, it is still a leading cause of death and disease burden after heart disease, stroke, and cancer. And you're probably wondering, well, if that's the case, why have I not heard about this, right? And this highlights the insidious nature of exposure to dust and the delay often between the exposure and when you experience the disease, right? Workplace exposures likely contribute very significantly to our chronic obstructive pulmonary disease statistics, right? So that's exposure to dust that include coal, grain, silica, as well as certain fumes and chemicals such as welding fume, isocyanates, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And we mustn't forget that anything that reduces our lung function can increase your risk of lung disease. Smoking is a key one of these, right? See, our lungs, they can clear away some contaminants that we breathe in using coughing and the mucociliary clearance I talked about earlier and the alveolar phagocytosis. But smoking overloads the clearance mechanism. So what happens is many contaminants won't get caught and removed normally or with the efficiency that they should be removed with, and their retention time within the lung increases. So this means that those harmful contaminants, they stay in the lung longer. And in some cases, they can get absorbed into the bloodstream where they can go on to cause further harm to other target organs. So how do we assess our risks? Well, firstly, have competent people doing the risk assessment. They need to understand the stuff that I'm talking about today. They need to understand the biology of people, as well as the nature of the hazards and how people are exposed. How the hazards are generated, how they're transmitted, and how a person is exposed to them, for how long, right? And for how much. Conduct a qualitative risk assessment to start. Look at the safety data sheets that you've got of the materials that people might be exposed to. Conduct your risk assessment. Right? Conduct workplace inspections. Look at your equipment. Make sure the equipment is maintained and operating correctly. Train people on what to look for. Okay, make them aware of the hazard so that they can proactively manage their exposure. You can also conduct semi-quantitative risk assessments. So when we look at occupational exposure standards, you might want to identify similar exposure groups. So they're groups of people that might have similar exposures to certain hazardous chemicals. You may wish to do exposure monitoring and compare the monitoring results against your occupational exposure standard. If you wish to, if it's a particularly serious hazard for you at your workplace, you might undertake some statistical analysis. Health surveillance. Are people actually being hurt? That's the purpose of health surveillance, because if people are being hurt, then your controls are not working. You need to go back and improve those controls. And finally, injury and illness reporting. When people are getting hurt, you need to keep records of that. But let's look at more robust controls, right? Substitution and engineering controls. Select materials that are silica-free or asbestos-free, right? Or have the lowest content of silica. There are prohibitions in place regarding the use of asbestos, so you need to be aware of that, right? With respirable crystalline silica, we can no longer manufacture engineered stone. And that decision, to no longer be able to manufacture engineered stone means that we have lost an industry in Australia. Very different to prohibiting a hazardous chemical like asbestos. In this case, they have not prohibited the use of crystalline silica, but instead have prohibited the use, manufacture and supply of engineered stone, the product. So I think that distinction is quite interesting. I mean, you can't just prohibit the use and supply and manufacture of any product containing crystalline silica. That just would not be plausible. So they have prohibited a product effectively. My view on that is I think that was the wrong thing to do. I think that what they should have done to not kill an industry outright is I think that they should have put the prohibition on the use of particular manufacturing techniques that generated the dust that people could then be exposed to, because that fundamentally is the issue. The exposures were not controlled. And I'll probably cop quite a bit of flack for that comment, but honestly, that is, I think, what they should have done. There needs to be a degree of balance between our industry and performance of our industry and the protection of workers. And I think that it could be done if the manufacturing processes were actually robust enough to protect people. We could still manufacture engineered stone safely. Which brings us to the other types of engineering controls we could use to actually reduce a person's exposure to hazardous dusts and fibres. For example, with vehicles, you can enclose the cabs with high efficiency particulate absorbing filters. So they're HEPA filters, right, for dusty earthworks or mining. You can use wet work methods to reduce dust, such as wet cutting or polishing, water sprays during earthworks. Water sprays, rubber curtains around conveyor transfer points, local extraction ventilation, either fixed or on tool, e.g. for mixing, crushing, milling, drilling or chasing activities, shadow vacuuming, such as during drilling, and vacuum cleanup rather than sweeping. You know, don't blow dust with compressed air. Don't use that to clear work surfaces because that dust is just going to become airborne and other people could breathe it in. But to get back to my other point, there is a control here which is not discussed but is equally as effective at prohibiting or eliminating the hazard entirely. And that is to eliminate the person from the exposure itself. And the way you do that is to automate a manufacturing process. If you can automate a manufacturing process, you can remove the person from the exposure pathway. And I think this is what I mean when I say I think prohibition of engineered stone products was not the way to go, but rather we should have been looking at ways of improving the process of manufacturing such that people are not exposed in the first instance. And through an automated process, you can largely achieve that and then take a person out of the exposure pathway entirely. I think that would have been a far better solution for our industry and also for the workers. Because I think what's going to happen is there's still going to be a demand out there for beautiful engineered stone products, and what we're simply doing is we're just shifting that exposure from Australia to overseas. In developing countries where more vulnerable workers like children are now going to be exposed to make those products because the demand is still going to be there around the world. We're just pushing this into the black market. Not a good idea, not a good outcome in the long term. And I've put some diagrams up there from Safe Work Australia just to show what you can do with the various tools that can improve or reduce the exposure in the worker's breathing zone. If you can't take the worker out of the equation, these are options that you've got. And notice in the image of the person using the grinder that the position of the extraction system, the local exhaust ventilation system, is very, very important. You don't want to be positioning the LEV to be drawing the contaminant through the person's breathing zone. You want it to be pulling the contaminant away from the breathing zone. That is the correct positioning. And for PPE, be very, very careful. PPE should be used in combination with other more effective controls. But if you must use PPE as an extra layer of protection, just understand that it's not completely reliable. You will need to fit test respirators to people. There needs to be a lot of discipline around the use and selection and maintenance of respirators. Make sure you also select the correct one using AS/NZS 1715. Okay, so for mechanically generated dust, you may use a P1 particulate filter. For thermally generated dust, you must use at least a P2 particulate filter. So keep that in mind. A lot of people don't know that, but that's all in AS 1715. And as mentioned in my Wittenoom example, make sure you decontaminate PPE. Dusty clothing and PPE can expose workers and others to contamination. And you can decontaminate them using a number of options. Use an industrial M or H class vacuum cleaner on your PPE. Provide a laundry service for dusty PPE and workwear, supported by a policy. Require workers to change contaminated clothing after each shift or their work breaks, and provide workers with rubber boots, aprons, and disposable overalls. Okay, things that are easy to clean. I once worked at a mine site. It mined lead and silver, and you often find those two together. Their decontamination system was quite sophisticated. change rooms, showers, chutes for the contaminated material. Because those workers at the end of their shift, they were going back to their accommodation. They're going back to the mess. They were potentially agents of spreading contaminants all through the accommodation, right? So they had a very, very sophisticated decontamination system on site. And you need to make sure that is working very well. And you'd probably be wanting to do some spot checks as well, contaminant monitoring in the various parts of the accommodation, in vehicles, to actually see whether any of that is making its way off the site. So lots of things to think about. But I guess if I had to leave you with one key message at the end of this all, it's the dust that you can't see that is particularly harmful. So please remember that as a key takeaway message from today's session. I hope that you found it informative, and I hope it gives you a better understanding of these hazards and the challenges that we experience in managing our exposure to hazardous dusts and fibres. But until next time, be well, stay safe, and I'll see you later.